Welcome to the InfoSec Insider podcast, brought to you by URM, the UK's leading information and cybersecurity specialists.
Hi, my name's Annie and I'm here today with George Ryan and Jack Woods, who are both consultants with us at URM. Welcome to another episode of InfoSec Insider. So today we're going to be talking about some of the more niche and unusual questions about governance, risk and compliance. So first question for you guys is, what is one thing your clients rarely ask but should?
Yeah, so I think one thing we often see with kind of the GRC is we'll really heavily focus on the C, which is obviously the compliance, but actually the governance and the risk can be kind of skipped over. So what we see is some certifications, such as with ISO 27001 or Cyber Essentials, you can tell a big difference between who's doing it just to get compliant to it and actually who's looking at this kind of maintenance of it and continual improvement. If we take Cyber Essentials, for example, where that's a snapshot at that time, some people may fall into that kind of area where actually the other 364 days of the year, once they're compliant, they kind of forget about it and then comes up that's for renewal and suddenly compliance is back on. So from my perspective, clients not really focusing on the actual enablement of GRC and just focus on that kind of box ticking as such.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I think something to focus on of that kind of GRC triad, if you will, is that compliance is largely just the baseline. You're meeting the requirements, but that doesn't mean that you're reducing risk to your organization. If you're meeting requirements of a standard, that doesn't necessarily mean you're reducing risk. If you're not taking other actions, implementing controls around that, kind of making sure that you're having the governance forums to discuss those controls and make sure that you're hitting the KPIs that you might need to be hitting for those controls. So if vulnerabilities are being scanned, who's reviewing those? Are they being triaged correctly? That kind of aspect of it. And that's the risk and governance part that we need to focus on. You don't want it to be, like George has just mentioned, that kind of tick box exercise. And I think an area that a lot of organizations tend to kind of fall down is kind of what George was alluding to earlier about the fact that passing an audit kind of gives them a false sense of assurance. It means that, oh yeah, well, we passed that audit, so we don't have to bother with this for another year. And like George correctly pointed out, it's a snapshot in time. It's the same with 27001. We can only look at the evidence that we're provided. We ask for evidence, and that evidence is reviewed. But that doesn't mean that in 12 months' time there won't be any non-conformities because we didn't potentially look at something. It's a specific area that we would be focusing the audit on. So it may be that passing audits can sometimes mask unresolved issues as well, or it can be hiding those issues because you feel that, like I said, that false sense of assurance that, oh yeah, well, we've got the certificate now, so there clearly weren't any issues, where actually there might be, we just didn't cover them during that audit.
Yeah, and I think off the back of what you're saying as well, I think we're seeing that with AI at the moment, aren't we? That compliance is seen as it's almost like this all or nothing. So it's not a case of let's govern our AI. It's either, are we going to get a AI related certification? Then we'll put some AI stuff in. But if we're not going for certification, then we're not going to bother governing it at all.
Yeah, and obviously there's a danger involved in that. That is quite an obvious one to point out. Is the potential misuse of those AI tools is going to potentially cause serious issues, and not even necessarily misuse, but we've seen it in the news recently. There's been an organisation that their entire database was deleted by the AI kind of tool that they were using within a few minutes of using that tool. So there are things that are happening, and so you need to make sure that you've got controls in place. But the other point to make around that is that often there's a focus on, do we have controls rather than would they actually stop an incident? I've been into lots of organisations where they've got policies and procedures for the sake of policies and procedures, and they're not really worth the weight of the paper they're written on, because they're not actually protecting anything. It's just documentation for documentation's sake, and that makes it more difficult to manage as well. So that kind of compliance aspect of making sure that the documents are right and that they've been reviewed and approved and all of that stuff becomes more difficult to manage the more documents you have. When we're looking at 27001, there's a fairly obvious list of documentation that is required by the standard, and it points those out. And then there's some that, yeah, you could document it, but you can also show it via kind of screen sharing or in person. If the auditor is on site, you can show them how that is, what process is working in real time, rather than having to show them a policy or a procedure and then show them that same evidence. So I think that's something that there's a lot of potential issues around as well, is that clients come to us inundated with documentation, and we have to go in and kind of strip those documents back and make sure that actually, yeah, that's what the standard requires. This one's potentially surplus to requirements. And that's another key area as well.
So just sort of following on from that point you've made there, Jack, is a policy enough on its own? I'm guessing the answer's no.
Yeah, I kind of alluded to it, hadn't I? It's difficult because standards like 27001, for example, there's requirements that so clause 5.2, requirement for an information security policy, that on its own isn't going to be enough to show that you're compliant to that standard, for example, or show that actually your information security is to the level that it needs to be. The issue starts when people are not made aware of those documents. If you've got 10, 20, 30 documents relating to security compliance and secure development and information security and access controls and all of those things, if people aren't aware of those policies, then they're useless. There's nothing, it just makes all you've created is documentation that's going to sit in a SharePoint completely siloed until the next audit. And funnily enough, it is a requirement of the standard that people are made aware of the information security policy, and it's communicated to interested parties and things like that. And part of the controls from 27001 5.1 of Annex A talks about obtaining acknowledgement from the kind of staff to make sure that they have read the policies or procedures that are relevant to their role. So yes, the short answer is no, policy isn't enough on its own, but the long answer is the awareness is key. You need to make sure that people are aware of the policies and what they need to be doing in conjunction with that documentation, making sure that they're aware of the potential disciplinary actions or potential consequences, rather, of them not adhering to those policies and procedures, not only internally in terms of disciplinary, but externally. If they were to kind of send confidential information via a plain text email or personal information via a plain text email and that's intercepted, they may not be aware that actually there's a information classification policy that identifies the labeling and handling requirements for confidential information or personal data. And so if they're not aware and there's a data breach because they've made a mistake, you can't really say to them, oh, well, you should have known, you shouldn't have done that, X, Y, and Z, if that policy hasn't been communicated to them. If they're not made aware of that, it's just a document. So it means nothing to them until they know.
Yeah, and I think that's it, isn't it? It's just one block in many. When we're talking about layered defenses, etc., that also applies to how we document things. It's not just here's our intent, but actually here's how we can carry things out to meet our intent. I think one thing as well that we see is that over time you do have this kind of operational drift as such. So what's in your policy itself may not change, but actually the tools you have or the way you do it may change, which is why you would need your processes, procedures to update accordingly. And yeah, it can't just be all there in one policy. Policy on MFA and the fact you need MFA, well, that's not going to magically come out of the text and apply and configure your MFA and check that it's in place. It sets out what needs to be done, but again, it's doing it. Same with ISA, isn't it? The controls are in the standard, but you've actually got to implement them. You can't just copy and paste them and then you're secure, which would be worrying for us.
So next one for you guys. What's a security policy that everyone signs but nobody actually follows?
So I think from experience with clients, often it is what's in kind of the acceptable use. Obviously, you've got the more niche policies where it's like, oh, I didn't even know we had one for that. But acceptable use is one of those. You kind of read it, you acknowledge it, and again with the operational drift, over time you can actually forget what's acceptable and what's not as such. So, let's say you've got something in your acceptable use that you shouldn't really be, live streaming films while you're away, but you get to the hotel, it's 9 p.m. You're like, actually, I want to rest, recover, watch a film. The TV at Premier Inn doesn't work. Get your work laptop out, and you kind of download that film or you watch that film. And again, it's quite hard because essentially with the acceptable use, you kind of look at it and then you're kind of done as such. I think equally now relating to that, we're getting it more with AI policies as well. A lot of people can read it, and if you don't actually know what constitutes AI, you may be completely against the policy because you're actually not understanding what it's asking from you as such.
Yeah, I think part of it becomes a culture problem as well. If there are, and it's something I spoke about earlier, if there are documents upon documents, if there are policies upon policies, and you've got 30, 40 documents that you're expecting staff to read, it gets to a point where they'll probably just say that they've read it even if they haven't, because they've got day jobs that they need to be doing, and they can't sit down for hours on end and read through documents that may not actually even be relevant to them. I think kind of George has alluded to two good ones there, acceptable use and AI. I think another one that we see organisations do, and it's sometimes part of an acceptable use policy, is bring your own device policy. And so the use of personal devices to access organisational data. Sometimes you see people doing the wrong things on their devices, and they shouldn't be kind of accessing work data on that personal device, or if they are, it should be that they're connecting to a VPN prior to doing that. They shouldn't just be on their personal laptop sending emails to themselves and then viewing those emails, that kind of stuff. So that's another one. And then I think to kind of build on that, another one that we often see, or I often see issues with, is clear desk and screen. Organisations, especially those that are certified to 27001, will often have a clear desk and clear screen policy, meaning that people should leave their desks clean and tidy, and they shouldn't leave confidential information on their desks. They should lock their screens when they get up, that kind of stuff. And everyone's guilty of it. We're human. Sometimes we get up from our desk and we don't press Windows L and it doesn't lock our screen, or we think we've done it and it hasn't. Kind of, you've pressed them too far apart, or however you've managed it, you haven't locked it. It does happen, and you see that when you're doing site visits and you're walking around and people have left their screens unattended while they've gone to the toilet or gone to get a coffee, or they've left documentation that realistically most people in the office shouldn't be able to get eyes on, but if they were to walk past that desk they might see. So I think that's another one where it becomes a culture thing. And I think George slightly alluded to it with the fact that if it's not part of their day-to-day, they tend to forget. And so if you aren't living and breathing that documentation, those processes, it does become a case of you will potentially forget how that works. But then there are also some documents that you shouldn't, or you might not necessarily need to read. So someone that's working in HR probably doesn't need to read the secure development lifecycle policy. That if they're not doing development, they wouldn't need to. If they might want to, if they need something to help them fall asleep at night, they might want to read that document. But there's no real need for them to read that document unless they are doing they're part of that activity. So I think it does come down to culture. I mentioned as well policy fatigue. If there's too many documents, people will just say they've read it even if they haven't. So it becomes difficult to manage.
Yeah, and I think off the back of what Jack's saying as well, going back to our kind of previous question, when it does come to the clear screen policy, etc., one of the reasons a policy on its own may not be enough is that actually, to make life easier for everyone, potentially you could look at having privacy screens. Anyone that gets the train to London has probably seen a lot of internal documents that they shouldn't see from other companies. If you ever go on the tube, you just look opposite you and you can use a reflection to see what's on people's screens. So again, when we're getting to the kind of policy part of it and expanding upon that, the policy fatigue, there's also things that you can put in place that actually can reduce that fatigue and help prevent it, not just relying on someone having read the policy, but having a control in place to make it easier for everyone and therefore a bit more secure.
No, I think definitely with that clear screen one, because that's something, it's just a case of forgetting one time and suddenly there's a confidential document that really shouldn't have been seen that, people can see. So absolutely. Next one for you guys to consider, what's the most absurd compliance requirement you've ever seen a company prioritise over actual security?
Generally, what I seem to find is that it's more a case of when you say, oh, how come you do it like this? What's the reasoning? And the answer tends to be, well, that's just how we've always done it. And there's no actual kind of effective evidence for that being the best way to do it. It's just, well, we've always done it that way. We're going to continue doing it that way. And that's just how it will kind of be as such, which again, that kind of thinking goes against the concept of continual improvement. In 10 years' time, your company should be doing things differently from 10 years ago because the landscape changes and therefore what you need to have in place and do should reflect that.
Yeah, definitely agree. I've been into numerous organisations where you ask them questions about why they're doing something and they can't give you a straight answer on it. It's like George mentioned, it's well, we've always done it that way, so why wouldn't we? A good example of that I've come across recently was password requirements. I was working with an organisation that suggested that they had the same password requirements for general user accounts as they do for admin user accounts, but those requirements were stricter. So essentially everyone that was a general user had to follow the same requirements that an admin user or a privileged user would have to meet for their password. And then when we were talking about maintenance accounts, for example, we talked about the fact that, actually maintenance accounts have got more stringent controls around them than the privileged user and the general user accounts. And so it's the case of, well, why is it that those two kind of general and privileged user accounts have the same password requirements? Yes, they're strict, but you've got then stricter requirements on the maintenance accounts. And the likelihood is that it was risk-based and they thought, oh, well, there's less kind of general use of maintenance accounts, so we need to put in more stringent controls to make sure that actually those accounts are locked down quite stringently. But because we couldn't talk about it, there was no evidence of any justification as to why that were the case. It was a bit of a gap for them because when we were talking to them, you've got people in the IT department and the directors, and they're all having the conversations like, well, why have we come to that decision? Should we be doing this across all accounts? Should we potentially de-escalate some of the requirements of general users so that they're not held to the same level of kind of security as the privileged users, which again is risk-based. If that's what you want to do, you could do that. I would obviously err on the side of caution, and if you're going to have stringent controls around user accounts, I would make it so that they're very stringent for all accounts rather than reduce the requirements per account. But yeah, that's the general things that you kind of see, is that people just do these things because it seems right rather than any actual risk reduction in what they're doing, because they might be really overcomplicating it, and they might be spending thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands on tools, and they might not actually really need it. It might be that actually your landscape, your threat landscape, is actually much smaller, so you don't necessarily need to spend that amount of money on those tools because that's covering everything and you just need it for this specific area. So I think that is the kind of the scenario that you see often, is that people just put things in place, whether that's policies or technical controls, without actually thinking about it. They do that because it looks good, potentially, rather than actually there being any risk reduction.
I think off the back of the passwords as well, we've seen it where we've moved, haven't we, from what used to be a forced change every 30 days to actually some cases 90, some cases 180, where it was actually realised that with the 30-day change, all people were doing was adding a 1, a 2, a 3, an exclamation mark to the password, and that was considered done and dusted. So even in terms of actual compliance requirements that come from certifications, that changes as well. What 5 years ago was deemed compliant and the best way to do it actually isn't currently.
Yeah, and you're even seeing that now with, I think, the NCSC released communications on it a few weeks ago relating to the use of pass keys rather than passwords. So using kind of fingerprints or face scanning, stuff like that, as a default authentication option rather than putting in passwords. It makes it potentially a little bit more difficult for someone to steal your fingerprint, I guess, than it would be to try and brute force your password or successfully phish you. So I think there's even, like you say, there's even more kind of changes even in the recent weeks to that kind of guidance. And like we say, it is only guidance. You don't have to do those things. But generally, they are trying to point you in the right direction with a lot of this stuff.
And that's something we've seen in, I think I'm right in saying, in Cyber Essentials as well, isn't it? They've introduced passwordless options in the last couple of years, sort of moving away from that idea of changing your password every 30 days. Next one for you to discuss is, what is the easiest way to tell if a control is effective?
I think the way that you do that generally is being able to identify what it's actually reducing. And how you're evidencing that it's doing that. If you put objectives or KPIs in place for those controls, you need to. So, for example, with 27001, it talks about monitoring, measurement, and analysis of controls that you're implementing. And part of that is that as part of the management reviews, you'd be looking at those controls, reporting any issues with any of those controls, saying, oh, actually, this isn't reducing the risk in the way that we would have wanted it to. So we need to, I don't know, purchase a new tool maybe, or implement more stringent technical controls, or even create more clarity around procedural controls. So make sure that the policy is actually really clear on what needs to be done, so that there's visible kind of evidence that actually, that control's working. I think something that you talk about, and I think George has mentioned MFA earlier, it's if you're enabling MFA, you can see whether that's working or not. You can see if people are using that, if it's being enabled and enforced across the landscape. You can see that control is in use and it's working. And if there are people that are struggling and they can't log on, maybe there's an additional awareness activity that needs to take place with those. Maybe there's kind of additional training required around the use of MFA and what that's going to look like and how they need to be accessing their account information. But it's generally, where you can show that there's been a reduction, making it easy to identify that reduction. I think that's probably the key or the easiest way to tell if something's effective.
Yeah, agreed. I think that MFA is a good example, because again, you start mixing that one in with your phishing, don't you? And you're testing MFA in terms of were they to click a phishing simulation or a real phishing email, but actually phishing itself, you may run phishing simulations to see how many clicked in the first quarter, how many clicked in the last quarter of the year, were there any differences, etc. I think one thing to note with the control effectiveness as well is that a lot of organizations can get kind of mixed up in this whole, well, the controls must be effective because we haven't had an incident. But you've actually got to factor in that actually sometimes you can just be lucky. So a lot of incidents we see, like people have actually had things exposed to the external, facing public internet for ages. They just haven't actually potentially realized there. And, arguably they've been going, well, we're effective because we've not been hit. And actually you've been effective because you got lucky that no one's exploited that yet. So always one to keep in the back of your mind as well.
Yeah, I think that's part of those kind of, and I think we'll probably come on to it later about convincing executives to care about risk. But it's one of those things that it's a bit of a cognitive bias because, I think it's called normalcy bias or something like that. And it kind of reinforces the belief that the future will resemble the past. So if you've not had any incidents in the last 2 years, then, oh yeah, we're not going to have any incidents in the next 2 years sort of thing. Whereas we generally know that that's probably not going to be the case. There will be something that happens. You are very, very lucky if you go through the kind of the life cycle of your business without suffering an incident. I think you are probably in the 0.001% of organizations that will probably go through that, if that is the case. But yeah, I totally agree. I think it's one of those things that because it hasn't happened, you think it won't. And that's it lulls you into a bit of a false sense of security.
Yeah, and I think especially with the kind of massive amount of AI in the world, there's the changes from that as well. So, I've seen it personally where actually things have existed where they shouldn't be in an organization. And it was just a case of no one's happened to accidentally come across that, but where they've brought in a new AI tool, which is designed to find things for them, that's actually highlighted that for them.
Amazing. Thank you, guys. So I think, Jack, I think you alluded to this or began to sort of discuss this, but what would you say is the hardest part of convincing senior management and leadership to care about risk before an incident happens?
Yeah, I think kind of going on what I was talking about a little bit, the cognitive biases that people have around risk, and sometimes it's quite intangible as well. It's difficult to explain what the risk is if you can't use scenarios or experiences or even kind of relevant industry incidents to show to the executives what that could do to your organization. I think it can be quite intangible. So I think using real scenarios, using things that are happening in your industry or kind of broader to say, look, I appreciate it's not the same industry, but for example, the attacks with M&S and stuff like that, it's, yeah, okay, you might not be a food supplier or a supermarket chain, but these things still happen across any organization, not just because they are a supermarket. So being able to use those examples is a good way to convince executives, because actually if there aren't real life experiences, like I say, it's difficult to then say, oh, well, it could happen because there's no evidence of it actually happening anywhere else. So I think that's probably one of the key things to think about. I think part of it as well is the kind of risk cost benefit analysis. If they can't see the damage that it would do to the organization in terms of finances, sometimes it makes executives or leadership less likely to act because they don't see it as something that's going to cause any major issues for them. It makes it more difficult to suggest, oh well, we need to pay, I don't know, £100,000 for this tool, because if we don't and there's an incident, it's going to cost us 1.1 million, for example. If there's no examples of things like that happening in the real world, it's very difficult to then justify that to your leadership to say, oh yeah, we need this additional money because we just need it just in case, sort of thing. It makes it a bit more difficult. So I think being able to point to those relevant examples and saying, well, had they had a password manager in place, or had they had this SIEM tool in place, or had they been using a SOC, they might not have suffered that incident. It's all about the lessons learned from those incidents and making sure that you use the lessons learned that come out of those to your advantage to make sure that actually the executives need to be on board. This is why, and present that to them. A lot of ways that organisations tend to do that now is through business continuity and disaster recovery exercising. So I know that we've got teams that go into organisations and perform disaster recovery exercises and say, look, worst case scenario, server goes down. What does that look like for this team? How do you get it back up? What are your recovery time objectives? What are your recovery point objectives? That kind of stuff. Making sure that actually, they understand that's what a real life scenario would look like, but also they can then see it firsthand. Oh, this is how we should manage it. We should probably implement these additional controls. Otherwise, we might have some big issues should this actually happen to us.
I think that's it as well, isn't it? Kind of similar to what you're saying. Sometimes it is about letting them know about the near misses, that actually what you've got in place has prevented that. So, for example, if you've got it where you're using AWS, it's set to auto scale, and you say, actually, had we not had that feature, we'd have hit bandwidth today. Our resources would have been absolutely done for. It would have been slow. We'd have had complaints. But because we've got this, actually, we've completely avoided that. I think one thing to note for kind of people as well, chances are it's going to be a bit easier to start convincing executives. So, for example, what we have out at the moment is the government have this new initiative at the moment, which is their cyber pledge. Part of that actually is requiring board members, if they decide to go with the pledge, to actually have some form of risk training and some ownership at the top. If you look into what's kind of in Parliament at the moment, which is the Cybersecurity and Resilience Bill, that's currently undergoing amendments still, but one thing that's noted there is, again, board level responsibility. So hopefully it starts making your life in terms of convincing a bit easier, because actually we can see the government intention of having it at that board level a bit more. And as probably everyone knows, once regulation and compliance starts requiring it at the board level, people start paying a bit more attention to it when they realise they could be on the line where it to go wrong.
Yeah, and I think the start of that as well was quite a key point, is that, and I'll frame it in this way so it's more clear for everyone, success in cybersecurity and information security often looks invisible because you can't see the incidents, because they're being prevented. It looks like there's no problems. And so what you were saying about actually reporting on those near misses and making sure that they're aware of those makes it more obvious to them that actually, the investment is necessary, it's required, we need to do this. Because its success is invisible when it comes to cybersecurity and information security. If you aren't suffering incidents, they think, oh well, brilliant, we don't need to carry on paying for this tool because we clearly don't need it. Whereas actually that's not generally the case. It's that everyone's actually doing their job, and that's why you're not suffering. So I think that's probably one of, if not the key things to point out to the executives, is actually, I appreciate it looks like nothing's happening, but actually this is what's close to happening. This is why you need to continue that investment into these controls, these tools, these technologies, to make sure that we can stay on top of that stuff. I think the other part of it as well is that people often see risk mitigation as something that's going to slow things down. It's going to introduce friction, and it comes back to that culture thing. You need to make sure that you're framing it so that actually risk is helping. You're making sure that, it might add a day onto a negotiation, but in the long run, if that organisation suffers a breach, you may come out of it kind of scot-free, or you may be compensated for that breach because the security team have done their job and they've done the due diligence and they've made sure that actually the risk is either being mitigated or there are compensating controls around that risk to make sure that in the event that something does happen, there are other things that are going to take place so that you can hopefully be returned to as much normalcy as possible.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that kind of big time at the moment as well, aren't we? Where it's this kind of gold rush to use AI, use the cloud, and actually, your IT or security team is saying, we'll take a bit longer, make sure that what we're putting in isn't staying anywhere it shouldn't be, where's it actually being held? If we cancel the contract, what happens to that? And yeah, like Jack says, initially it can be a bit of a pain, but over time you start going, thank goodness we did that and we're covered there.
Yeah, and I've worked in organisations where I've come in and kind of helped manage third party risk, and my go-to phrase was a little bit of pain now should hopefully prevent long-term pain in the future. And I think that's probably one of the key kind of pieces of information that I got from being part of third-party risk management, was that actually, short-term pain equals generally long-term gain if you do the things correctly.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time today, guys. If anyone wants to ask Jack and George a question, you can follow the link in the description of this episode, which will take you to a form on our website, or you can just pop it in the comment section below. So thank you so much for listening today, and we will see you next time. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we would really appreciate it if you could spare a moment to leave a rating or review at ratethispodcast.com/InfoSec Insider. To listen to more episodes, you can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Podbean.
Thank you for listening to URM's InfoSec Insider podcast. For more information, visit our website at urmconsulting.com.